Thanks for that, Hazel. And my apologies that I'm joining by my phone right now. I was having some internet issues. But I think the description for the meeting probably summarizes nicely the context of what we're trying to do here. We a group of people who serves as the national committee to the International Sustaining Arctic Observing Network, SAON, through their various roles as direct representatives to SAON or roles on some of the sub-bodies, chairing sub-bodies, et cetera. We collectively wanted to support a meeting that we thought would meet some of the objectives that SAON's trying to accomplish and what we can do nationally reflected in that. And what we often come back to is a sense that we lack a sort of structural coherence to our observing networks. How do they relate to each other? How are they connected? And there's often a desire to see some kind of either through a diagram or a directory, some kind of assembly of who's out there doing what. And so this meeting really arose from a desire to see kind of a glimpse at or a subset or a snapshot of who's out there doing what and how they're connected to each other, but also to explore the concept of network analysis as a tool, as an analytical tool to help us wrap our head around how groups interact and how we can learn from network analysis to maybe improve these interactions, support connectivity and cross-group learning where that's needed. And so many members of the National Committee to SAON are part of the organizers of this call. You're going to hear from first from Alice Bradley, who has organized such a network analysis before in the Arctic observing space, also Margaret Rudolph. Oops, sorry. My phone just rang. And so the purpose of this meeting is to really be exploratory. We recognize this is kind of an experimental approach, what we've laid out here today. And so we've given some breaks in the agenda to kind of check in and see how things are going. So I'm gonna, in a moment, turn it over to Alice to kind of set up the introduction to these concepts, to this process. We'll have a little Q&A so everybody can kind of get a sense of if we're all on the same page about what we're doing. And then in 2 different breakouts, you are going to interact with other people on this call and share about your network and how it connects to other things. And then we'll have a report out at the end. With that, I think I'm just going to turn it over to Alice. And since I had, was doing this from a phone, if there's something I missed or forgot to do in my introduction, just please let me know, Alice or Hazel. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. I think you covered things pretty well, but if questions come up at any point, feel free to just drop them in the chat. So I'm going to give a brief background on kind of documenting the network of Arctic observation or Arctic observing organizations. And I'm going to use the term organizations very, very loosely. We'll come back to that at some point during this discussion. But to put this in a little bit of context, there are dozens, many dozens of organizations working in the space of Arctic observing. These range from kind of huge institutions, global programs, to small projects that are all working in this space and all have some needs of communicating with one another. So they range in size, scope, level of activity, amount of funding, capacity to do things, and have some sort of interactions. And so this figure on here is just trying to kind of lay out things on space of kind of geographic scope from local up to global, and kind of target observation uses between scientific research, monitoring, operational kind of uses, decision, policymaking, and then coordination. But again, not exhaustive, and it's really the point here is that there's a lot of organizations working in this space. Not only are there a lot, but then there's a lot of interactions happening between them. So organizations are creating other organizations, sometimes at an alarming rate. They're funding other organizations, funding other projects and efforts. So these might be in kind, something like providing secretarial support for another group, or financial, supporting an entire organization, funding salaries, supporting individual activities. Organizations will share people in common. So often we'll find the same individuals are showing up on lots of different committees. They'll be running joint activities. So these might be things like writing big reports, or other kind of joint efforts like running an early career fellowship program. Organizations work together at different events, things like meetings and conferences. And then often they'll have very similar or shared goals that overlap in really substantial and meaningful ways. And sometimes the shared goals part of the interactions between organizations don't necessarily track with the other kind of forms of connections. And so at that point, we end up with duplicated efforts without enough communication between them to keep things moving effectively. So the context here and some of the background behind this call is that we've been working on a social network analysis approach to kind of evaluating the broader set of organizations working in this Arctic observing space. So social network analysis is a set of analytical tools used to evaluate networks modeled as a set of nodes, that is individual points and edges or connection between those points. There's a lot of things that we can do with this, but some of the really relevant ones are measuring resilience of a network. And then we can also measure the centralness or how connected individual organizations or pieces of organizations are. And so we've been working on kind of building out this network map, trying to document the different connections between all of these organizations. But what we've found is that the data collection process here is colossal, to say the least. So in order to figure out how all organizations are connected to all the other organizations, we have to ask each organization about their connections. This is time consuming, especially as you start adding more and more and more organizations, because for each new one, you add a substantial number more possible connections. And to date, we've interviewed about 15 organization leads, so people who are kind of well connected, know the connections within their organization to others, about roughly 40 other organizations. But at this rate, for every other organization we interview, another one gets added onto the list. And so we're kind of pausing to take this more community focused or kind of a different approach to both the data gathering and scoping out what the role of this sort of network analysis might be. So far, what we've found, again, from a limited subset of these interviews, is that having people in common is a really, can be a very important way that different organizations share information with each other. And usually this is in the form of one or more individuals that are active on multiple committees, and they serve as the communication link between them. This can be very efficient for getting information between different groups, but it does mean limited transparency, and it's not always a resilient connection. That is, people do occasionally say go on vacation or, heaven forbid, retire, and in those cases, the connections between these organizations can break down. Formal information structures or information sharing structures can fill in some of these gaps. This is definitely the most common type of connection between organizations. This takes the form of things like meeting reports, newsletters, sharing minutes from meetings. Much more reliable in the long run. Meeting reports don't tend to disappear or go on vacation, but the downside is that these connections can be passive, and so you have a variable level of information uptake on the other end. So I'm sure we've all had newsletters sitting in our inbox that we have not opened for some number of months. And so these, while they're there, they're not necessarily getting through. And then the last type of connection that I want to highlight right now are the role of joint activities in connecting organizations. So these tend to be events at larger in-person meetings. So AGU Fall Meeting and the Arctic Observing Summit were the two that came up in a number of the interviews done so far. Again, this is incomplete data collection. There's likely other events that are key. But this opens one of the questions that if these events are providing such a key role in connecting different groups working on related topics, can online or remote meetings duplicate this functionality? And is this something that we kind of need to design for in thinking about these kinds of hybrid or online events? And so with that context, I want to introduce today's activity, which is going to be a small group network documentation exercise. So our goals here are kind of threefold. One, to get to know the other people and organizations working in the Arctic observing space. Again, there's a lot of us doing very different kinds of things, often with pretty similar end goals. And then to explore how these different groups connect to each other, and importantly, where there are needs for more robust connections. And then finally gather some more information for scoping this more extensive network documentation project. So what we'll do is put roughly 3 people in a breakout room together, with the idea that each person represents an organization, project, or some sort of group that they are familiar with. And for the 15-20 minutes we're in the breakout room, the goal here is to try and identify how these different organizations in the room connect, whether there might be people in common, different activities, different things that happen together. What we're likely to see is that there'll be some really obvious answers and some less obvious answers. And so it'll be a chance to really kind of dig into how organizations working in this space are really interacting with each other. And so we've got a Jamboard set up, and I'll show us all how to use that in a minute, where we can just label the Venn diagram with the connections between them. So I would like to emphasize that this does not have to be perfect. We're going to have pretty randomly assigned breakout rooms. And so there'll be some that'll have a lot of connections, some that will have somewhat fewer connections. And often we'll be kind of representing organizations that we don't necessarily fully speak for. But it is an opportunity to kind of think about the organizations that you work with and how they might connect to others. So what counts as an organization in this context is any group that works together towards a goal related to Arctic observing. So the 3 criteria is it needs to have multiple people involved. If you're an organization of one, that's just an individual. It needs to have some sort of activities or tasks, something that it's actually doing, and some sort of connection to Arctic observing. So the more focused groups tend to be a little bit easier to document than larger institutions. So a good rule of thumb is if the group has meetings and has action items, that's the right scale for this. I thought I saw a hand come up at one point.
I had my hand raised, sorry. So if we wear, a quick question, if I can ask one. If we wear multiple hats, like related to multiple organizations, should we choose one for this activity, or should we think of ourselves as filling in a circle in the Venn diagram? Does that make sense?
Yes. So for each, we're going to do 2 rounds of the breakout room. For each one, pick a particular single organization. So just 1 hat per breakout room round, but you're welcome to switch in between them. Yeah, I believe a number of us have a lot of hats involved. Margaret?
Yep, we have a question coming in the chat about the time frame to think about, in the sense of like, are we talking about 5 years, within the last 5 years, or forever, or that type of question?
I think we should think about kind of the time scale of maybe last 5 years. There certainly are organizations that have historically been connected, but if those connections have been lost, I think we should kind of keep it focused on the present or present-ish. All right. So the Jamboard tool that we're going to be using will look something like this. And I'm going to go ahead and actually switch screens over to a demo of it. I believe some of you guys have used Jamboards before. It's basically an online version of a whiteboard and sticky notes. You can pick out which basically whiteboard you're using. So I've got this one set up to use as a demo. The first thing we'll do in one of these, so for each breakout room, go ahead and just pick using this little Explorer bar at the top, a blank template to use. As long as everyone in the room is on one template, you're good to go. So you can go ahead and label using the text, using the text box tool down here that you're working with a particular organization, so say who it's with, and then go ahead and just add your name so that afterwards we have some idea of who's been in which breakout room. And then you can start adding sticky notes. And so, for example, these three organizations, the IARPC Observing Team, RNA Co-ops, and IASC all participate in the Arctic Observing Summit. And so that makes a sticky note, which you can just drag right into wherever you want to put it on the template. So sticky notes you can click on to edit. We can color code them if you'd like to. We've got a set of kind of recommended color coding down here. If you want to zoom in to be able to read that easier, the zoom button is up in this corner. So we have left 5 extra minutes on the first breakout room round to kind of explore a little bit and get comfortable with the platform. Mostly we're expecting this will be discussion with just some sticky notes going on over the course of the conversation. We will be saving these boards at the end, so please go ahead and leave any notes that you want to write on the board. And what's there at the end will be saved as a PDF. Are there any other questions? My chat window has vanished underneath the shared screen.
There aren't any in the chat, Alice, and I don't see any hands popping up. So,
okay, great. So Hazel, could you put the Jamboard link in the chat so everyone can get on there?
yes, I can do that.
And again, to get to a blank template to use, it's this little deck of slides right up at the top. You can just click around to whatever one you want to use. So I'm going to click back to these. So moving into our kind of next steps of the meeting, I have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any clarification or anything. And then we'll split into breakout rooms, kind of round one, where we've got 20 minutes. We'll reconvene, talk kind of briefly about what worked, if there's any questions that came up. And then we'll break into a second breakout room, different groups of people for a second round before coming back to reporting out and the full group discussion around the role of these different organizations in the community, what we need in terms of networking and network documentation, and what future steps might be.
Alice, I've got a technical question. So when you get in your
Yes.
breakout groups, one person clicks on the icon on the top to pick, the Venn diagram, and then will everybody be able to, in that group, be able to add things to it? Does one person have to do all the adding?
Everyone can add to it. You just want to make sure that everyone in the room is on the same, basically slide number. So if I'm on tile number 8 here, we just want to make sure that everyone that I'm talking to is adding things to the same whiteboard, basically.
Okay.
Yep, and we'll have a couple people floating once we're in the breakout rooms. We have a couple people who helped organize the call who will bounce around to different rooms. And I have a slide I can share as well that will show you how to ask for help or raise your hand once you're in the breakout rooms if you're having any issues. And are we ready to make that move? Any last questions in the main group? Okay, great. I will just very quickly show this slide for folks that are not familiar with the Zoom breakout rooms. A window will pop up in about 60 seconds that will ask you to join your room. Go ahead and join your room. There might be a little bit of shuffling people around in the first minute or so because a couple new people have joined the call since I made the breakout room. So just bear with me for that. The breakout rooms will not be recorded, though we will have the record from your Jamboard sessions. And you can see these different boxes highlighted. So if at any point you're having issues, you can leave the breakout room and come back to the main room where I will be waiting. You can also raise your hand with this ask for help button and someone will jump into your room. And if anyone's having issues accessing the Jamboard, we would just ask one person in the call who can access it can share their screen. And then everyone should be able to get on that way. And that's with this green share screen button. Okay, with that, I will go ahead and open the breakout rooms. And just say Alice, Margaret, and Olivia, you're going to end up in the same room. If you could just not join the room, that would be great. All right, you should be able to join and we'll send a notice a couple minutes before you should come back to the main room. All right, and Hayo and Allison, I am assigning you now. That option was not available before. And let me put, I'm gonna put you in room 2. Pull Sandy back. Okay. I think everyone's out. Sorry, Sandy, for the swap up. I threw Hayo in there instead.
No problem.
Okay, we had great numbers. Will is joining as a participant. And all of you, are you able to move yourselves around?
Yes.
Okay, great. Then maybe what we should do is have everybody join one of, rooms. Everyone just join one of the rooms. So I can, maybe Margaret join room 1.
It looks like it's still pointing me towards room 2.
Okay.
So I might as well just go back to room 2.
Cool. That sounds good. Room 3 is not a real room. Alice, if you want to join room 4 and Olivia room 5. And then I'm going to stay here in case anyone jumps in. So if you check in and they're doing good, come back in here and I'll send you out again.
Yep.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks.
Oh, and Jackie just joined.
Yep. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, sorry, I
Maybe-
got conflicted on 2 different meetings. I didn't start early enough.
No worries. Yeah.
Room 1 might be able to fit another person.
Okay, great. Okay, Jackie, I'm gonna move you into room 1 and trust, we're in breakout rooms now.
Okay.
We're doing an interactive exercise. So I'm gonna trust the folks in there to explain things to you, but if that
Sure.
feels difficult, just hop back into the main room and
I'll be
and-
fine.
Okay,
Okay,
we'll
thanks.
sort it out. Okay. I moved myself instead of moving you.
That's okay.
Okay, assign you to room 1. Okay, that should work.
Great. Thanks.
Yep, thank you. Recording. And then I'll turn it over, I believe, to Sandy and Alice to guide us through a wrap-up discussion.
Alice, do you want to lead us in?
I kind of thought you would, but
I'd be happy to, but I think we're probably just to the first order curious how that went as an exercise, and how you feel it maybe reflected our larger goals for this meeting.
Well, I think one thing I would point out is that we built it was good going back the second time. So I think we added more in the stickies. There's a lot of crossover in that Venn diagram between the 4 projects that were presented. And that I think we got a lot of detail in there. So I think it was useful.
Yeah, Twyla.
Yeah, we also got a lot out of having some additional time. And one thing that we sort of realized along the way was that we weren't doing, if you were wanting us to have much information in the parts that weren't overlapping, we weren't at all really focused in that. And so we were really interested in all the overlap space. So that's kind of an area where you might not be getting much information if you want to know about the non-overlapping space.
Yeah, great piece of feedback. Our group kind of arrived at that at the very end and started to work on something related to that. So we did have 2 specific discussion questions, and feel free to continue to comment on the process as well. The 2 specific questions were, what kind of support does the community, meaning, the greater community of organizations and people engaged in Arctic observing networking, need in terms of networking and network mapping? Where do you think we should go with this? And then the second question is, how could we do this to be more inclusive of Indigenous communities and organizations, knowing that IARPC is not often a place where we see a lot of participation and engagement from that direction. So the floor is open, and we'll monitor the chat as well. Oh, thanks for dropping those in there.
This is Jackie. I could see this having some type of breakout at the, for the Alaskan community, for that part, for the, at the January Alaska Marine Science Symposium, and some breakout, I mean, even associated at the Ocean Sciences meeting, some of these meetings where you could actually have like a 3-hour session, you have people in the room or online. I mean, I thought this, in the short amount of time, I think there's a lot of summary information on these Venn diagrams, but they really need to be fleshed out in some type of report to really get people to meet. So support maybe somebody in IARPC. I don't know how to do that, to write the report up.
I have some thought. I'm Mike Brook. I'm with Alaskan Travel Consortium, and I apologize. I was kind of late for this. I think I got the time wrong. But a thought about your second question about Indigenous communities. It's just my point of view, but I feel like phrasing, using the vocabulary of community impact is one way to resonate more with people in community. So rather than talking about sea ice, talk about food security or transportation. Rather than talk about permafrost thaw, talk about infrastructure damage. Rather than talking about, I don't know, ocean acidification, talk about, fish die-offs, that kind of, so making sure that I think of it as connections being encoded with why it would matter to me as a member of a community. I feel like that's to me, a better way to connect to somebody who lives in a community than to think of it as a branch of science or something along those lines. So that's one way to do it. I think that would be an improvement. To your first point about what do we need to do this mapping? I mean, we were kind of joking about it in our session that I can think off the top of my head of about 5 similar initiatives that are out there. I'm personally involved in 2 or 3 of them. So there's a lot of desire to map these types of initiatives and connect them by geography, connect them by branch of science, who's involved, everything that we just did. So there's definitely an appetite for it. I mean, I feel like we're maybe going to be a little bit doomed of having too many of such initiatives going on. So I wonder if maybe, I don't know how to do it. I think the biggest organization needs to be the one that kind of creates the gravity around it, is kind of what I'm feeling like. I kind of thought that this is the first I knew of this activity. This seems to be a more gravitationally attractive version of this thing than the ones I'm involved in. So I'm sort of feeling like this might be a kind of the winner, so to speak, but I don't know. I mean, I think that a lot of people maybe have different points of view on that. So that's a little bit of a, I don't have an answer, but I think it's a bit of a reality check on what's out there right now around this kind of thing.
Yeah, those were super helpful points, Mike. And I think we had begun to network with some of those other groups before this exercise. And so if you want to even just list in the chat who some of those other groups are, and if we can see if they're similar to the ones we were already looking at, corresponding with. Craig had a comment, and then following Craig, Britt.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. To your first and your last point, I do think the IARPC Indigenous Fellowship is a good place to start and continue with building more Indigenous involvement in spaces like this. In particular, I think one of the main reasons for that is it pays for participation in these spaces, and not only kind of bolstering and getting more participation amongst all of the collaboration teams to help facilitate these conversations, work together with your new IARPC communication special or Indigenous communications, but like Melissa. I think that's like an easy in is to kind of build on that momentum and allowing for space to influence discussions, and maybe more importantly, looking further down the line, decision making on the next Arctic research plan. I think one issue for me thinking about this network mapping activity, or even the current IARPC fellowship, is that we're kind of, the Indigenous community, myself included, were brought in sort of after the fact. A lot of these decisions were already made. So building that capacity on the front end and allowing space for the Indigenous participation and community members who might want to be involved in the fellowship or IARPC networking, and kind of build their capacity to make decisions on how best to move forward the next go around, would be my recommend. Like, that's what I'm going to recommend towards the end of the IARPC Indigenous Fellowship, is that we were brought in after the current Arctic research plan was already in place, and there's a big emphasis on co-production and working with Indigenous communities to kind of move forward. But there's a lot of these decisions and everything have already been made. So I mean, this is definitely was a very fun start, and it was really, really fun to see the overlap. But if we are looking to get more Indigenous participation, from my perspective anyways, I think that is a really, really good place to start, is paying for participation and building that capacity from these boundary spanner type roles or folks who might be interested in actually participating. But yeah, paying people.
Great, thank you, Craig. That's a really valuable perspective, and I'm glad that in your fellowship role, you're going to be able to convey some of these things directly to IARPC leadership, even as we're within our team kind of absorbing some of those observations as well. We've got time to hear from Britt and Javier, and I also want to make sure that Alice gets to kind of have a minute to kind of close things out, to say how she feels things went from her perspective, and maybe Margaret as well. So Britt.
Thanks. Speaking kind of to Mike's point about all of these different mapping activities that are going on, I think that people have lots of different kinds of connections that they're trying to tease out. And I'm coming into this activity today, I wasn't real sure of the constraints that around the kinds of connections that you were asking me to identify. And so we I think talked a lot about connections that may not have been as finely honed down on Arctic observing as you may like them to be. So one thing to consider is just maybe putting some guardrails on the kinds of connections that you're looking for a little bit more in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Britt. That's a great suggestion. As you know, we're hearing some appetite, I think, for moving forward with these kinds of things within our collaboration team, and reviewing our structure and of the process moving forward is a great suggestion. Javier?
Yeah, just following Mike's and Craig's comments, I think that it is really very important that we as we envision the future, looking at the future, we don't transition on the basis of a gravitational driver force based on organizations, and rather to the listening to the communities and trying to aim at the convergence between science and community needs and community sciences. I think that there is where there is a need to evolve and make it more meaningful for communities. Anyway, just wanted to highlight that is really very important as we move forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And we shared a group, and I think we maybe made better progress just thinking about the shared goals. Yes. That felt like a very grounded conversation, especially for projects that didn't have a lot of obvious overlaps. Mm-hmm. Alice, do you want to reflect back on the process at all, and or Margaret?
Sure. So I have been quickly clicking through the different Venn diagrams since I was in a session for the breakout room for the last one. And I am slightly blown away by the number of sticky notes in my future, but in the best possible way. So first off, thank you everyone for spending some time doing this. I hope that everyone's experiences reflect some of the comments that we've heard about kind of the value in thinking about how different organizations and how different people interact with this broader Arctic observing community. I very much appreciate the comments on kind of how to better integrate Indigenous communities into these sorts of conversations and these sorts of discussions. And that's one of the things that we're thinking about moving forward from this. This activity was very much designed for the IARPC space. And kind of the technology and Zoom platform that we're used to here. But with the idea that this is not a one and done sort of approach to understanding how everyone is working together or not. So I'll be kind of pouring through these over the coming weeks. There's some comments in the chat about reporting back about kind of some of the takeaways from these different diagrams. And I certainly will be pulling something together that we can share with the group. But just the sheer magnitude and number and variety of connections between these different organizations, I think has been, I mean, I expected it, but also it's been a little bit staggering to see just how many we can get down when we have some time and some unlimited internet sticky notes.
Thanks, Alice. Margaret, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think this is really insightful. I think our broad goal was to be exploratory. So that's kind of why it was so open-ended. At the same time too, just stepping back and asking the participants and observing networks kind of what they would see as useful. And so I think we got a lot of insight both from your comments as well as kind of looking at your sticky notes, as well as it's kind of interesting the lack of individuality, like not wanting to put stuff in your own little circle and just really wanting to collaborate, I think is really great. It kind of just shows the broader community and kind of what we all want to collaborate more and have useful outcomes and all those aspects. So thank you.
Great. Well, I want to add my thanks to everybody who participated, and really especially to thank Olivia, Alice, Margaret, Will, and Hazel for the extra effort that went into preparing for this meeting. And Alice, we look forward to having you report back on it after you've had time to digest it all. So I think we are 1 minute past our time. Thanks for spending extra time today on this call, and we look forward to building on this in the future.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.